This ship is one of the reasons Germany didn't invade Sweden in World War II. But it's not a battleship. It's a coastal defense ship. And I've got to say, having looked into the history of these things, coastal defense ships have a level of aura I was not expecting. I mean, tell me this doesn't look like something straight out of Battlefleet Gothic. When someone says pocket battleship, you may well think of the German Deutschland class from World War II, which weren't battleships at all, but heavy cruisers with oversized guns. And for me, coastal defense ships have a more valid claim to the title pocket battleship. In the late 19th, early 20th century, this was a relatively popular type of warship. Kind of miniature battleships displacing anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 tons, with a small number of heavy guns. Typically a main battery of 2 to 4 weapons, calibers in the 8 to 12 inch range, plus secondary guns, anti-aircraft cannons, sometimes torpedoes, and thick armor, belts up to 10 or 11 inches. But they lacked the kind of range and speed to be considered proper ocean-going capital ships. They were designed for littoral operations, close to shore where a smaller, shallow draft vessel actually has some advantages. Now, coastal defense ships are distinct from monitors. Both were designed for shallow waters, but monitors with their massive guns were optimized for shore bombardment and not much else. They were slow with little to non-existent armor. Coastal defense ships, on the other hand, had real armor, some speed, and much broader tactical flexibility, built to survive in combat and hit back. So why build coastal defense ships? Well, maybe your country just couldn't afford a full-sized battle fleet. Or maybe your naval strategy was defensive by design. You needed to defend against battleships, not build your own. Because with their heavy weapons and armor, coastal defense ships was still dangerous. They weren't designed to maneuver on the high seas like a battleship. They didn't have anything like the range of a battleship. And being smaller, they couldn't carry as many guns as a battleship. But shallow draft coast defense ships could go places battleships couldn't, making them almost like mobile coastal fortresses. Powerful artillery batteries that could easily pop up anywhere along the coast. In other words, coastal defense ships were not for power projection, they were for holding the line at home. And they were a great form of deterrence, more than enough to make a potential invader think twice. Easily capable of seeing off cruisers and, if handled smartly, even posing a threat to battleships. And they were cheap, because number one, they just weren't that big. And number two, speed and range were very much secondary concerns. You know, when you think about the costs associated with building a warship, a high-performance propulsion system is really up there as one of the biggest expenses. With these things, you don't need to worry about that so much. Not a bad choice if you have a small naval budget and a long coastline to defend. Maybe lots of islands, peninsulas, estuaries, fjords. This is why coastal defense ships were so popular with Nordic countries. By the turn of the 20th century, the navies of Scandinavian nations like Sweden and Denmark were mainly concerned with deterring their powerful neighbours, namely Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. Apart from anything else, these smaller countries couldn't afford their own version of the German High Seas Fleet, much less the British Grand Fleet. What they could afford were relatively small, short-range ships with thick armour and big guns. This idea also appealed to other countries when their naval strategy was primarily defensive, like Austria-Hungary in the 1890s, or Imperial Germany prior to the Anglo-German naval arms race. You know, around about 1897 when the Kaiser decided he wanted a proper ocean-going battle fleet to rival the Royal Navy. Before that though, Germany built several powerful coastal battleships of the Siegfried and Odin classes, each armed with 3 9.4-inch guns. These actually had quite an unusual, strange-looking arrangement with the 2 forward guns each in a separate turret side by side. The French were also fans of the coastal defense ship concept. In the late 1800s, it lined up quite neatly with the Je ne Cole doctrine that battleships were on their way out in favour of fast commerce raiders and small vessels armed with torpedoes. Because it was felt that a number of moderately sized gun-armed ships were still needed as a defensive measure while the torpedo boats and cruisers went out to do their thing. Some French coastal defense ships had a pair of 12 or 13.4-inch guns. Of course, these these larger powers like Germany and France did also build actual battleships at the same time, because even with things like the Je ne Cole movement, there was always a pro-battleship faction within the navy. For other countries like the Netherlands, coastal defense ships weren't just for protecting the homeland, but also for guarding colonial possessions like the Dutch East Indies. The British never really messed with the idea of coastal defense ships, because, well, they had such a huge fleet anyway with plenty of full-size battleships. The British did build small gunboats for inshore and river operations and monitors for close bombardment, but again, those aren't quite the same thing. Though the Royal Navy did press older battleships into a coastal defense role. At the start of World War I, Britain still had 40 pre-dreadnoughts. Yes, they were old and obsolete, you won't see them at Jutland, but they were out there guarding the British coastline. And crucially, guarding coastlines across the British Empire, leaving the new battleships free to face off against the Kaiserliche Marine in the North Sea. Some coastal defense ships were designed for use in rivers, like the Argentinian Libertad class, sometimes referred to as Riverine battleships. And look, this thing was only 2,300 tons, but it's armed with two Krupp 9.4-inch guns. It has an 8-inch armoured belt. It's a battleship on a river. I mean, by the standards of small craft that can operate in shallow waterways, this thing is an apex predator. Kind of like if you have a lightly armoured vehicle that's arguably not a tank, and take it someplace where the enemy doesn't have any tanks. Suddenly, it's definitely a tank. Yeah, Riverine battleships definitely have a bit of Scorpion in the Falklands energy. But did coastal defense ships see much in the way of actual combat? Well, 3 Russian coastal battleships, the Admiral Ushakov class, saw action in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. When they were transferred away from the Baltic Fleet, their natural habitat you would think, to reinforce the Russian Pacific Fleet, only for all 3 to be lost or captured at the Battle of Tsushima. And by the outbreak of World War I, most of the older coast defense ships were pretty much obsolete, but they could still play supporting roles. The Austro-Hungarian Monarch-class ships used their 9.4-inch guns to blast enemy positions along the Balkan coast. In Montenegro, Albania, and in the Gulf of Trieste. Yes, Austria-Hungary did have a navy. Despite most of the empire being landlocked and not particularly enthusiastic about boats, one of its most decorated officers was none other than Captain von Trapp. Yes, that Captain von Trapp. Before he was leading sing-alongs through the Alps, he was launching torpedoes in the Adriatic. Then there were the kind of newer mini-dreadnought-style vessels built around the time of World War I that really do deserve the title coastal battleship, like the Norwegian Purvin class, which were actually under construction in Britain when war broke out, so they were never delivered to Norway and instead were requisitioned by the Royal Navy, who designated them monitors and sent them out to shell German positions in Flanders. Yeah, really not helping beat the rumours that coast defence ships and monitors are basically the same thing. I did a short on monitors what feels like years ago, which probably deserves a revisit in long form, so make sure you're subscribed for that one. This still left Norway with some older coast defence ships, like the 2 Eidsvold class. These had been launched in 1900, but they stuck around until World War II. Pretty hopelessly obsolete by this point, they were both sunk by German destroyers at the First Battle of Narvik. Also seeing action in World War II were the 2 Finnish Väinämöinen class ships. Please accept my apologies for all pronunciations in this video. I like to think I'm not too bad on the Scandinavian languages, but Finnish is something else. Armed with 4 10-inch guns, plus a secondary battery of 8 105mm. Yeah, I'm mixing inches and millimeters. I don't know, it feels weird to say 4.1 inch instead of 105mm. These ships fired on Soviet forces at the beginning of the Continuation War in 1941. One of them, Ilmarinen, was subsequently lost to mines. But the flagship, Väinämöinen, managed to evade heavy air attacks and survive the war. Yeah, you're looking at the Baltic hide-and-seek champion, 1944, only to be handed over to the Soviets as reparations. Sweden's 3 Sverige-class vessels were more battleship-like than any other coastal defense ship. Coming into service from 1917, they took design cues from contemporary dreadnoughts. Armed with 4 11-inch guns, 8 6-inch secondaries, plus a substantial anti-aircraft battery. And this is Sweden, so of course everything is made by Bofors. An 8-inch armoured belt, and they were capable of a not at all sluggish 23.5 knots. At nearly 8,000 tons, these were effectively the capital ships that the entire Swedish Navy was built around. And some sources even suggest they played a role in deterring Germany from invading Sweden. You know, Germany was highly reliant on Sweden for essential resources like iron ore and ball bearings. And while it could get some of these resources through complex trade arrangements and diplomatic back channels. A much more reliable way to get all of them would be to just, invade Sweden. But even though Germany was already occupying Norway, an invasion of Sweden would involve a lot of naval operations and maritime supply routes. And while the Swedish Navy was no match for the Kriegsmarine on paper, these powerful coastal battleships acting defensively in shallow littoral waters, together with swarms of destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines, they just would have been a nightmare to deal with. So the mere existence of these ships may have been enough to tip the balance and make the Germans say, you know what, never mind. Funny thing is, coastal defense ships were exactly the kind of vessels France and Britain assumed, or maybe hoped, that Germany would be forced to build under the Treaty of Versailles. When it came to replace the 6 pre-dreadnoughts the German Navy had been allowed to keep, they were limited to 10,000 tons per ship. So the expectation was, they'll just have to build some Scandinavian-style mini-dreadnoughts for coastal defense. There's absolutely no way Germany could build a proper battleship under 10,000 tons, right? No, but they could build a long-range cruiser with 6 11-inch guns. The Deutschland-class so-called pocket battleships, which were initially known in German as Panzerschiff. Armoured ships. Funnily enough, also the official designation of a number of coast defence ships, like Panzerschiff in Swedish. The Deutschlands, though, were clearly for offence. Ocean-going raiders with a decent top speed of 28 knots and a stupidly long range of 19,000 kilometres. And despite being labelled armoured ships, they weren't even that heavily protected. Their main defence mechanism being shoot the enemy from distances where they can't shoot back or just run away. And in fairness, they were later redesignated heavy cruisers. These ships were approved by the Weimar Republic, by the way, at a time when Germany was committed to at least technically following the rules. Before all pretenses were dropped and they just started cranking out Scharnhorsts and Bismarcks. But the moral of the story is, when you're trying to restrict German rearmament, you need to be specific. So could coastal defense ships ever make a comeback? Well, in the modern world, they would suffer the same disadvantages as full-sized battleships. Versus aircraft, submarines, precision-guided munitions. Though we do now have the concept of the littoral combat ship. These are more like small frigates or corvettes designed for inshore operations, not mini dreadnoughts. But in the end, I think coastal defense ships deserve more love. They were kind of the real pocket battleships. Much more so than the Deutschland class, which were only ever called pocket battleships thanks to the British press doing what it does best. Writing hyped up sensationalist articles. When it came to smaller ships that were actually designed to take some punishment, to provide real deterrence, even against much larger, better equipped navies. And crucially, at an affordable price. These things just made sense and offered a great return on investment. Especially when that return was, not being invaded by Germany. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I very much appreciate it. Not sure how many fellow enjoyers of mildly obscure warship typologies are out there, but you are very welcome to this content and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a like and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Also, be sure to share this with anyone who might be interested. It helps a great deal. And let me know in the comments if there's any other lesser known or underappreciated types or classes of warship that deserve a shout out. Working on this video has thrown up a lot of other naval history topics that I can't wait to tackle. So I will see you again very soon.